Hello, good morning, Prof. Heng.
Good morning. Good morning to all my
Good
friends,
morning.
dear colleagues.
Yeah,
Good morning. I can hear you quite well. I hope that you can hear me also.
yeah, I can hear you
Thank
well.
you.
Okay.
Thank you.
It-
Good morning, Prof. Heng.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good morning, faculty of Diponegoro University. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, pleasant to be with you too.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Prof. Heng.
Yeah,
How are you today?
I'm doing very well. I hope you are well too.
Great, thank you. Nice to hear that. So what time is it there?
It is 9 a.m. I believe it is 1 hour earlier
Oh
um,
yeah.
in Java. So we
Right.
are quite fine.
It is 8:05 here.
Professor Laksono, there is a little bit of an echo on your side, but that's okay. I
echo.
can hear you, I can understand you. I just want to make sure there is no echo on my side.
Oh, your voice is good. Excellent. There's an
My
echo
voice
in
is good.
my voice.
I can hear you, yes. There's just a little bit of an echo,
Okay, wait.
but that's quite okay. I can hear you.
Okay, is it still the echo is still there?
It's better now. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, yes. The echo is no longer there.
Because I'm sitting next to Professor Heri Chandra, so maybe
I
that's the
see.
problem.
Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. So today, at the moment in our country, we are celebrating or commemorating the National Day for the youth pledge. So this is the moment when in 1928, every youth in Indonesia, they pledge together to acknowledge that we are one independent nation as Indonesia, one nation, one language. So everybody is still having a flag ceremony out there.
I see. No problem. It's okay with me. I have actually been to Diponegoro. I will talk a little bit more about
Really?
it. I will talk a little bit more about this in a moment.
Ah, great.
Yes. Um, I actually included a few slides, a few photographs in my PPT. So you will
Oh,
see.
great. Excellent. So, Prof. Heng, I heard that in Taiwan, the tea is good, yeah?
Yes,
Very famous for the
absolutely.
tea.
Diponegoro actually is an exchange partner, a collaborator of Tungha
Okay.
University. And so I
Mhm.
think we have very good contacts between the two schools.
Okay, great. Nice.
Yes, last year sent our two students to the Tunghai University for having student exchange programs, Prof. Heng. If you still
Yes,
remember that.
indeed. Yes, indeed. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And then we do really hope that at the times, if I'm not mistaken, there is an agreement between you and Professor Nur Hayati that uh, it is possible for some of the students from Donghai University to come to our faculty for having uh, what we call it as short visit to our campus. But
Short-term study, right? Yes, indeed. Absolutely.
yes,
Yes.
so it is possible for us to do that in the future, Prophet.
Oh, I very much hope so. Um,
Yes.
I need to inform you about one thing, which is that I am currently actually the Dean of the College of Tourism and Hospitality Management at another
Mm,
school, namely Overseas Chinese University, which is located also in Taichung. I am officially
mm,
still a professor at Tunghai University, but I'm seconded. That means I'm kind of on loan to Overseas
mm.
Chinese University for 1 year. And then at the end of this year, I will permanently move to Overseas Chinese University. So I'm kind of, you could say, finishing up my career at Tunghai University. But of course, I still know all the people there, and I'll be happy to talk to the Dean of International Studies who's a close friend of mine, Professor Liao. And we have many staff members at Tung Hai University who have been to Indonesia many, many times. We also have an office in Jakarta. It's called the TECO office, Taiwan Economic, Taiwan Economic Educational Council office in Jakarta. And so we have people there as well. So I can definitely put them in touch and encourage them to work hard on the exchange.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, here we
Good
have
morning,
Sukarni
Roheng.
Suryani.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's nice to see you finally, yeah? Although virtually.
Yes, Professor Sukarni, right?
Yeah,
Yes, indeed. Yes,
I
indeed.
am.
Good morning to you. Nice to see you here today.
Mhm.
Okay, I think we are going to start our visiting lecture,
Okay.
Prof. Heng. Yeah,
Indeed.
our dean already here now. Okay.
Alright, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. So good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And let me introduce myself first. I am Rahayu, and I'll be your master of ceremony for this exciting webinar. Second of all, let us thank God who has been giving us blessing and mercy so we can attend today's event in a good condition. I also would like to welcome for this event for our special guest, Dr. Professor Hank Feinkire, and also the Honorable the Dean Faculty of Humanities, Professor Alamsyah M. Pung, the Honorable our Head of Department of English Literature Major, Professor Aptika Arisandra, SSM Pung, as well as the PIC of today's event, Professor Sukarni Suryani, SSM Pung, and to all the audience who joined us in today's event. So we are really thrilled to have each of you here, and we're looking forward to an engaging session filled with valuable insight with our speaker today. Right, before we dive in, let me give you a quick rundown of today's agenda. So we'll start by singing our national anthem, which is Indonesia Raya, and then we will have opening remarks by our Dean Faculty of Humanities, and then followed by the main sessions where we'll hear from our guest speakers, Professor Hank Feinkire, for the topic propaganda and literary representation in British culture. And then we'll also have a dedicated Q&A section at the end. So after the delivery of presentation, feel free to jot down your question along the way and we'll make sure they get answered. Right. We know your time is valuable, so we're committed to making this session as informative and enjoyable as possible. Thank you again for being here, and without further ado, let's jump into our first agenda. So our first agenda, let's begin by singing national anthem, Indonesia Raya. For everyone, please kindly stand up, and if you're unable to stand up, please sit in upright position. And to the operator, if everything all set and ready, time's yours. And for the audiences, you may sit back down in comfortable position. All right, let's move to our second agenda, which is opening remarks. And there will be an opening speech by our Dean Faculty of Humanities, Professor Alam Shah M. Poon. For Professor Alam Shah M. Poon, if everything is set and ready, you may deliver speech and time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Rahayu. Ya. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Excellencies, the honorable guest speakers, Dr. Heng Finker from Overseas Chinese University, Taichung, Taiwan. Thank you very much. Welcome to Faculty of Humanities. The head of the undergraduate English Literature Study Program, Bapak Dr. Oktiva Heri Chandra, and then the moderator of this event, Arimas Arido Raksono M. Hum, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our online event, Propaganda and Literary Representation in British Culture, held by Undergraduate English Literature Study Program, and I am thrilled to have you all here today. In a world where information is both abundant and complex, the ways in which literature reflects and shapes cultural narrative are more important than ever. Today, we will explore the intricate relationship between propaganda and literary representation within the context of British culture, examining how literature can both challenge and reinforce societal ideologies. Propaganda has a powerful influence on public perception and thought, often shaping cultural identity in profound ways. By analyzing literary works through this lens, we can uncover the subtle and sometimes overt ways in which authors respond to research or propagandistic message. We are fortunate to have Dr. Heng Finker, who will share their insight and research on this fascinating topic. And then we encourage you to engage actively, share your talk, and ask questions as we navigate through this important discussion. As we embark on this exploration of literature and propaganda, I invite you to consider how these terms resonate in today's context. Your perspective and experiences will enrich our dialogue and deepen our understanding. And then thank you for joining us today. Let's dive into this compelling intersection of propaganda and literary representation in British culture. Without further ado, let's begin. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
All right, thank you so much for Dean Faculty of Humanities, Professor Alam Shah M. Poon, for the opening remarks and also the opening speech and warm greetings for us today. And yep, let's move to the most awaited session, which is the sharing session with Professor Heng Finker from Overseas Chinese University for the topic Propaganda and Literary Representation in British Culture. And for these sessions, there will be a moderator for Professor Arido Laksono M. Poon. If everything else set and ready, thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good morning, all. I think, am I audible? I hope it is audible. Well, it is actually an honor and it's a great session today to have Professor Heng Finker for our seminar today about propaganda and literary representation in British culture. So before we start this seminar, I would like to read a brief about Professor Heng vitae, curriculum vitae. So Professor Heng Finker earned his PhD from comparative literature in University of Illinois at Urbana, USA. And he also finished his master's degree from comparative literature from University of Georgia, America, and he finished his BA from the Germanic Language and Linguistic University of Antwerp, Belgium. And since August 2024 until now, he's the professor and dean of College of Tourism and Hospitality Management, overseas Chinese University, Taichung. I think we would know better from Professor Heng himself. So without further ado, I would like to give this screen and moment in time for Professor Heng. Time is yours, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Arido. Allow me to check first. Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yes, loud and clear.
And the video
Yes.
quality is also fine?
Video is good.
Yes.
I will tell you when there is problem.
Very good. Thank you so much. I would like to thank the Dean of the Humanities for his very kind introduction, as well as Professor Arido for his introduction. I offer my greetings to Professor Octiva, Professor Sukarni, and Ms. Ananda, and all colleagues and friends at Diponegoro University. It's really a very great pleasure and privilege to be able to be with you today. I must say that I am not 100% familiar with Zoom, the application Zoom which I'm using today.
Right.
I've used MS Teams for online lectures. I've used Google Meet.
Yes.
I've used WebEx. I've used the VOV, which is used in China. So I need to make very sure that I am able to load my PPT, which I believe is via the share function. Is that correct?
Yeah, right.
And then I need to go to documents. Is that right?
Yes, I think. Professor, you have 60 minutes later.
I have 60 minutes, right?
Yeah. Do you want more?
Yes, I thought it would be about 80 to 90 minutes, but that's okay.
Okay, it's fine. It's good.
It's all right. I can actually cut it short. I do not find documents so far. Do I need to go to whiteboard?
Wait. Or
It's not working so far.
would you like to? Can you send your material?
Maybe I need to.
So
Let
we
me
can
try one.
have.
I'm sorry. I need to leave the meeting for a moment and then come back because it says I have to adjust my computer screen settings.
Yeah. Mau di Oh, we have so far 115 participants of today's seminar. Wow, awesome. So I believe that everyone here is really eager to learn something about post-colonial something, I think. Let's see.
It relates with our previous meeting in our workshop, Pak Arido. If we would like to connect between literature and society, and how is the function of literature in society then?
Oh, now we have Professor Heng's back.
Okay.
You are still muted, Professor Heng. Your microphone.
Mute.
Yeah, it's good now. It's good now.
All right, very good. Let me try to share once again.
Okay, Prof.
Under share, I do not see where it says go to desktop. That's what I'm usually do with Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, and so forth. You go to your desktop and you can load your PPT, but I don't quite see that.
Ananda, can you help give instruction?
Can anybody
Oh
maybe?
no, yeah. It's working now, Prof. We can see your PPT now.
Okay, but I didn't open it yet.
We see on the screen trees, forests. Is it correct?
I am screen sharing, right?
Yeah, right. You're screen sharing. Yeah, it works.
Yes, but it should be on my hard disk. No, it should be on my USB. Okay. I know why. Okay. It is coming. It is coming. It is coming.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming.
I believe it should be okay now.
Yep. You can see your files.
Yes, I have many.
A lot.
Yes. I've been doing quite a bit. Yes. Too many actually on this.
Right.
I'm sorry. Please give me a moment.
No problem, Professor.
Thank
no
you so
problem.
much.
I myself also do not know technology, so I cannot help you.
And I double check everything twice, actually, yesterday evening and this morning. It should be here.
Don't worry, bro. It happens. It happens. Or maybe you can put it on the search. Oh, have you found it?
Okay, there it should be.
Yeah, Britain Picture Series, 1941, 1950, propaganda. That's right.
Can you see it?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Online lecture. Right.
Let me then play it.
But maybe if you can make it full size, Prof. For the view.
How do I do that?
Amanda, can you help?
Advanced sharing.
Can you help to find to make it bigger view?
I'm not sure.
It's okay, Prof. We can see and read your PowerPoint.
Let me check that. Advanced sharing options, maybe? No, because that's about who can share. It's not about the size. Like this?
It's smaller now.
The
previous one is bigger.
Is it bigger now?
No, it's smaller. The first one is bigger.
The first one is bigger. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. That's my problem with using Zoom. You know what happened with Zoom during COVID-19? Actually, the Taiwan Minister of Education forbid Taiwanese universities from using Zoom because the servers run through China. So when we actually first started using online applications, we were using Zoom, and then somebody figured out that the connections go through China, and they said, no, you cannot do it anymore. You have to switch to other applications. So that is very, very unfortunate. I should have checked this in advance. I'm very sorry about that. I thought it would be very similar actually to all the other applications. So now the screen is smaller. That's what you are saying, right?
Yeah, it's smaller. But Prof. Heng, if you can only send your file to the chat box, then we can help you to click the your PowerPoint from here. So you just say next, 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 and we can help you. If you can send it to the chat box.
Okay.
Yeah. To the message, yeah, chat box. You can send your material there, and we can help you from here.
Okay, maybe I have to stop the share for a moment and go to,
The chat box below,
yes.
next to the participants. And there is a symbol of file there, Prof. When you open the chat box.
I believe you have received it now.
Okay, wait.
It's coming.
Maybe it's coming. Maybe it's coming.
Yes, it's uploading. I can see it. It's uploading.
Okay. It's uploading. Okay, we'll wait. Sudah, Mas. Well, we have it.
Thank you.
Okay,
Wonderful.
let me help the host to help share your material.
Thank
it's
you.
still downloading, Prof. It's still downloading. Wait. Okay, it's still downloading. Still downloading? Still downloading. Are you at your office now, Prof?
I'm at home. This is my
Oh, at home. Okay.
this is my study room at home.
Okay.
In fact, I can already share something with you as you are working on this. Everybody, please, if you look over here,
Yeah,
let me let me stand up for a moment.
Okay.
All these books here, from here
Yes.
all the way to here,
Yes.
that is the collection of books which I would like to discuss.
Wow.
Written in pictures. I have a complete set of all these books.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I will talk about today is really based on 40 years of personal engagement with these books. I've been able to collect and study the entire set of books. There are more than 130. I also have some second editions and third editions and so forth. And there is the PPT. Thank you so much for your help with that. I do apologize for my lack of familiarity with the Zoom application. I've given lectures in China, VOV, in the UK with WebEx and so forth and so on, but I've not been able to use Zoom in recent years. So that's my problem. So my topic today is the Written in Picture series, 1941 to 1950, propaganda and literary representation. If you could go to the next slide, please. I should like to say, in fact, that I have a fairly long relationship with Undip. The vice president of Undip visited Taichung and Tonghai University in February 2018, and we were able to bring him to the Taichung Veterans General Hospital, which is located right across the street from Tonghai University. I believe that Professor Ambari is no longer the vice president, but he was the vice president for many years. So that's him there on the left, practicing surgery with an iPad together with the dean of the Taichung Veterans Hospital there on the right in the picture. And then the photograph on the right is a photograph I took myself when I visited Diponegoro in February 2018. Of course, that's the famous Sultan Diponegoro on the horse in front of the university. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. There is the welcome sign, which welcomed us, many professors from Taiwan visiting the university that day. And then we also had a meeting, and we had a signing ceremony. There you have the vice president of Diponegoro, together with a number of Taiwanese representatives, holding up the signed memorandum of understanding. And then finally, if you could go on to the next slide, please. On the left, yes, they had, of course, a speech, and there is myself with somebody I think you know very, very well. So I was there actually in February 2018 at Diponegoro. So I have very good, fond memories of my visit to your school, and I have a long-term relationship with Diponegoro. So if I may now go on to my actual presentation. In the next slide, I would like to give you an outline of my presentation. I will first use a PPT, and then I will follow up with a lecture without slides to offer more analysis and reflection on my topic. In the PPT, there will basically be 3 parts. First of all, I would like to introduce the Survey of Britain in Pictures series. I would like to talk about the construction of identity in Britain and offer a historical perspective from the 19th to the 20th century to sort of the middle of the 20th century. Then I would like to talk a little bit more specifically about the Britain in Pictures series, the way in which it offers us propaganda as well as literary representation. And then briefly, thirdly, I would like to make a contrast with what is going on in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s and talk about propaganda as it was practiced in Nazi Germany. As I mentioned, I have a complete set of the Britain in Pictures series, as well as copies of many of the other texts under discussion today. So my interest in this topic goes back, I would say, more than 4 decades, a very long time. And it grew out of my study of George Orwell when I was a college student. I was an undergraduate student, maybe 19, 20 years old. And I happened to find and buy a copy of The English People by George Orwell, which is one of the volumes in the BIP series. And I was quite shocked because George Orwell is a very famous writer, very famous for his novel 1984, and also the so-called fairy story, Animal Fable, Animal Farm. And so he's a very big name in English literature, but I had no idea that he had also contributed to this specific series. And so I bought that volume and became interested in the entire series, the so-called Britain in Picture series. I also have to add that I was able to undertake more research on this topic with the support of a grant from the Ministry of Science and Technology during the 2022-2023 academic year. Thank you. If we could go on to the next slide, please. All right, this is basically kind of a summary of the entire talk. I would like to mention that the series of books was published from 1941 to 1950 with the financial support of the UK Ministry of Information. So it began to be published during World War II. This is very important, in 1941. The idea of the series was to represent Britain and the British way of life. So this has to do very much with the outbreak of World War II. As the publisher said, it has become absolutely essential for citizens throughout the empire to take stock of themselves and their ideas and to express them to others. And there were 130 books in total. In fact, there were 126 because 6 volumes were announced but were never published. They were short. Each volume had 48 pages. They were quite beautifully designed and illustrated. And they were written by first-class British and Commonwealth authors. And I mentioned just a few examples right here. George Orwell, very big name in English literature. Graham Greene, Elizabeth Bowen, Edith Sitwell, Vita Sackville-West, Elspeth Huxley, John Benjamin, and many, many others. If you study histories of British literature in the 20th century, you will find all of these names right there. But also, there were people who were not necessarily literary writers involved with the series, scholars, scientists, artists, government officials, and other public figures. So what I can say is that taken together, the series presents a literary and documentary tour of Britain. And it talks about cities, villages, fauna, flora, railways, harbors, circuses, country houses, and many other subjects in British life and history. So the idea, as the publisher stated, was to give a comprehensive series of books at a popular price, illustrating in print and picture the life, art, institutions, and achievements of the British people. Now, what interests me very much is that this series offers a unique opportunity to examine the British literary scene from the 1930s to the immediate post-World War II years. It also allows us to look at what I call the constructions of Britain and imperial or perhaps also Commonwealth identities which were current at that time. And so my study examines these constructions and the ways in which the series reflects the emergence of what a critic by the name of Christine Blumel has called intermodernism in British literary culture. I mean, everybody knows about the beginnings of modernism at the beginning of the 20th century. And it goes on for many decades, of course. We know about Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, James Joyce, and so forth and so on. But then at some point, maybe in the 1930s, 1940s, we begin to have something called intermodernism. The late 20th century, we have something that people call postmodernism. So in between modernism and postmodernism, we have something which this critic calls intermodernism, and I see it reflected very much in this series. So intermodernists, unlike the earlier modernists, wrote mainly for popular rather than for highbrow audiences. They don't write for literary elites. They were interested in documentary style, mass media, and cultural expressions belonging to many different fields, including radio, film, and so forth and so on. So my position is that the BIP series constitute a fascinating site for the interrogation of intermodernist poetics in British literary and cultural history, as writers coming from diverse backgrounds responded to World War II, which creates a very urgent political situation, and they joined together in a common literary and ideological project. But now, before I talk about this more, allow me to go back briefly. If you could go on to the next slide, please. I would like to go on and, yes, maybe share some research questions. So I'm interested in the British cultural identity. We're talking about literary representation, right? Literary representation is about representing British cultural identity. So how is it constructed? By means of publishing initiatives and culture projects during the first half of the 20th century. And I think it happens by means of modern tourism and, the rise of the automobile. It happens through national culture, what I call registration and preservation projects. And it also happens through specifically government propaganda. I'm also interested in asking what trends were developing in the literary culture and the publishing market that influenced the BIP series. And I also want to ask what is the shared agenda that underlies the BIP series and brought such a diverse range of writers and intellectuals together. Next slide, please. So I go back in time. When you go back to the 19th century, to the Great Victorian Age, British identity is very much constructed around the idea of progress, science, economics, social mobility, industry. And one very specific high point of the Victorian age is the so-called Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all nations, which took place in London in a place called Crystal Palace from May 1, 1851 to October 15, 1851. They built a gigantic steel and glass palace for the exhibition. It became known as the Crystal Palace. And it was a gigantic event because it was visited by an estimated 6 million people. That means 1/3 of the population of Britain at that time actually came to London to visit this exhibition. It was a gigantic undertaking and it made a huge profit. And it was also sponsored by, you can say, the first soft drink, Schweppes. Schweppes is still a drink which is available today, which is still sold today. The whole exhibition was sponsored by Schweppes, the corporation. So it was a very modern sort of, pre-20th century event, which kind of, reminds us very much of the kinds of international exhibitions which are still taking place in the 21st century. Now, why was this exhibition visited by an estimated 6 million people? Well, because of the development of the railways, because of the railway network which connected England people were able to come to London and visit this exhibition. So that's sort of the great image of the 19th century. The railways, industry, and exhibition culture of the 19th century, which is symbolized by the Great Exhibition of 1851. Please, the next slide. Now, what happens in the 20th century? The railways, of course, still exist, but the automobile and the network of roads which connect the countryside and the cities and small towns of Britain become more important than the railways. And so we have the rise of modern tourism. And one famous example of this is a publication from 1927. Henry Morton went around England with an automobile and published a book called In Search of England in 1927, which was very popular. It was reprinted. And he followed up with a similar book called In Search of Scotland in 1929. In Search of England, by the way, is mentioned in a very famous novel called The Remains of the Day by the Nobel Prize winner Kazuo Ishiguro. If you have heard about Kazuo Ishiguro, The Remains of the Day is very much connected to this book, In Search of England from 1927. And as the next slide also shows, Henry Morton followed up with 2 more volumes, In Search of Ireland, 1930, and In Search of Wales, 1932. So he went around these places with an automobile and published travel guides for people who wanted to go and visit these places with the help of an automobile and be modern tourists. So this is really the rise of tourism in the 20th century, which I think has a huge impact on identity formation and literary culture throughout the 20th century. So that's the rise of modern tourism. The next slide tells us something about this. I will skip this for now. But it says, yes, the motor car is a metaphor through which national identity, in fact, Englishness, has been negotiated and constructed within England during the last century. So there's a whole article about this by Professor Sarah Gibson, English Journeys, The Tourist, the Guidebook, and the Motor Car in the Remains of the Day. And it specifically talks, in fact, about Henry Morton and his series of very popular automobile travel guide books. If you could go on to the next slide, please. I also want to mention briefly that there are very important national culture registration and preservation projects which are taking place at that time. Perhaps the most famous one was a 4-volume series called Recording Britain. It's a project which took place from 1939 to 1943. It employed many artists who created 1,500 topographical watercolor drawings of places and buildings considered to be of national interest. And it was a scheme for recording the changing face of Britain. Keep in mind, this is the industrial age. This is modernity. This is the 20th century. Cities are growing. Industry is developing. The automobile is becoming more and more important, right? So traditional Britain is really kind of under siege and is changing. And the countryside very much also is being swallowed up by progress in the 20th century. And so this creates a reaction. There are people who are saying, we are losing much. Let's have a scheme for recording the changing face of Britain. It is changing because of population growth, because of urbanization, because of industry, and then also once the war begins, because of the war and because of German bombings. Now, these were exhibitions which took place around the country, and then also it became a book collection, such as you see here, 4 volumes published from 1946 to 1949. So this is going on at the same time when the Britain in Picture series is being published. There's a connection between the two because some of the artists who were involved in the Recording Britain project also became authors of volumes in the BIP series. I will give examples of this in a moment. By the way, the entire Recording Britain collection is now stored in the Virginia and Albert Museum in London. If you ever go to London, it's a museum which I recommend very, very much. The V&A, as it is known, the Virginia and Albert Museum, has a fabulous collection. And the Recording Britain collection is one of the collections which is there at the V&A. Please go on to the next slide. The third, yes, there are some examples here of artists, images of cottages in the countryside, images of potteries where ceramics were being produced in England in the countryside, right? These are well-known artists, Thomas Hennell and others. Also in the next slide, We have John Piper, very big name in the English visual arts in the 20th century, making images of churches and then also images of country estates, country houses, manor houses, as they are known, of the British aristocracy, many of them going back to the Middle Ages or perhaps the 16th century, the so-called Elizabethan age. So these are good artists and they're producing very good art, which becomes part of this Recording Britain project. And then, of course, the third point in the next slide, please, is government propaganda. And the main topic I want to talk about today is the Britain in Picture series. But of course, there is so much more going on in the field of propaganda throughout this age, throughout World War II, and in the immediate years after World War II. Propaganda posters were very important. You have several examples here which became very famous during World War II. We have images of the British countryside and of small towns. And what does it say? Britain, fight for it now. Britain, fight for it now. And what they mean is this is the tradition of Britain as we have known it maybe for centuries. And it is under siege. It is under attack. So we have to fight for it. Next slide, please. More examples. A circus. Small towns with fairs and circuses. This is your Britain. Fight for it now. Or maybe an image of a small town with a medieval Gothic cathedral. Again, Britain. Fight for it now. So posters, very important as a tool of propaganda in World War II. And then, of course, I will not talk about it, but film and radio became very important tools for propaganda in the Second World War as well. Now, if we could go on to the next slide, please. This phase in British identity creation, in my opinion, really finishes in 1951 with the so-called Festival of Britain, which was organized by the Labour government, which came to power in 1945 at the end of World War II. They initiated a big project to kind of renew and relaunch British culture in the post-World War II years, and they called it the Festival of Britain. They worked on it for several years, and it was finally started in 1951. And they held it in 1951 as a centenary, that means 100-year celebration of the Great Exhibition of 1851, which I just talked about it. And as one of the politicians said, this was supposed to be a tonic to the nation. Now, a tonic means a refreshing, invigorating drink, right? Or medicine, right? So leaving behind the doubts and the devastation of World War II, moving on into the second half of the 20th century, it becomes the Britain of maybe the boom time of the 1950s when the economy was doing well. And then you have what? You have the modernity of the culture in the 1960s with liberation and youthful protests and rock and roll music and new fashion and so forth and so on, right? So that's what happens in the second half of the 20th century. And so the turning point really is the Festival of Britain, which was celebrated that year in 1951. If you could show the next slide, please. There were very important new construction projects in 1950, 1951 on the South Bank in London. And you see that here in the image on the left. Pretty much everything that you see there on the lower side, the left side of the River Thames was new. It was part of the celebration of the Festival of Britain. And one of the great buildings which came out of that project, which still exists and is still very important in London today, is the Royal Albert Festival Hall, which you see there in the photograph on the right. Many important concerts are still taking place in the so-called Royal Albert Festival Hall. Okay, but now on to Britain in Pictures. In the next slide, please. It is a series of 160 volumes, and it is organized in a number of topics. The first topic is the British people in pictures. The second one is the British Commonwealth in pictures. And then there's a third section, the English poets in pictures, which only has 6 volumes. Now, once the series was published, they also published so-called omnibus volumes. And omnibus volumes, I can hold up an example here, means collections of 5 to 6 of the previous volumes which had been published, which are now republished in a kind of collected edition. where they bring together 5 or 6 related topics, related volumes, and they create a kind of new sort of edition, omnibus edition in the late 1940s, right? So the volumes are very small. I have an example here. This is George Orwell, The English People, one small volume. You bring together 5, 6 volumes, and you create a big volume like this. This is the example of the British Commonwealth and Empire in an omnibus edition, right? So it was a very massive publishing project undertaken with government support. Now we have, under the British People in Pictures, first of all, a subsection called History and Achievement, 17 volumes. Then we have a whole series on art and craftsmanship, 19 volumes. You have a section on literature and belles lettres, which is 10 volumes. You have a section on education and religion, 6 volumes. Then there's a section on science, medicine, and engineering, 11 books. Social life and character, 16 books. Topographical history, that means local history, 16 volumes. 9 volumes. Country life and sport, 16 volumes. And natural history, 9 volumes. The British Commonwealth in Pictures has 7 volumes. The English Poets in Pictures has 6 volumes. Now, ladies and gentlemen, keep in mind, this is supposed to be propaganda. This is World War II. And yet what you talk about, local history, country life and sport, natural history, nature in Britain. So this already gives you a feeling that as far as propaganda goes, this is maybe a kind of soft propaganda. This is not the kind of propaganda which is really loud and very direct and in your face and totally aggressive, which is actually the kind of propaganda which you have in Nazi Germany during the World War II years, right? So I'll come back to this specific topic. I want to give you many examples of the volumes in the Britain in Pictures series. If we could go on to the next slide, please. There you have the Government of Britain by a civil servant, a very senior civil servant by the name of Gavin Young. So the Government of Britain, why does it have a lion? Well, because Britain traditionally is represented as a lion, the British lion, right? So there's a lot of sort of a British imagery, the royal house and so forth. The royal house, the Government of Britain are generally represented by means of a lion. And on the right, then you have images from the book. This is the House of Lords, which goes back, of course, to the Middle Ages and to the 15th and 16th century. So that's the ancient British political tradition. Next slide, please. Other example of history and achievement, British soldiers and British seamen. Why include 2 volumes on this subject? Well, it's World War II. British soldiers are very important. And of course, Britain has a very ancient military tradition. And of course, the British Navy is very important in World War II. So that's why you do want to talk maybe also about British seamen throughout history. Next slide, please. In art and craftsmanship, we have a volume on British craftsmen by Thomas Hennell, who is one of the artists who was involved in the Recording Britain project. So he made many drawings and watercolors for that project. And now he's actually also a writer and writes an entire volume on British craftsmen. And we have an image of a forge on the right. A forge means a place where you work with iron. If any students have been studying the Norton Anthology of English Literature, the second part, you will find the very famous writer Seamus Heaney in there, Nobel Prize winner for literature, right? Seamus Heaney. One of the poems in there is called The Forge, because it is really a kind of very traditional image of village life in Ireland and the United Kingdom in the 19th and early 20th century. Next slide, please. We also have a volume on British photographers by Cecil Beaton. He was a very great photographer. Also a stage designer for the theater and film. Actually, he won an Oscar award for his film design, for his stage design in film in the middle of the 20th century. We have a volume on British romantic artists by John Piper, another one of the artists who was involved in the Recording Britain project. Next slide, please. British cartoonists, a volume by David Lowe. British cartoonists, caricaturists, and comic artists. Now, why do I show this example? Well, because David Lowe actually was also a very famous cartoonist and comic artist himself. He is the one who created the famous character in British culture known as Colonel Blimp. It is actually a satirical representation of a kind of haughty, arrogant, sort of, late 19th, early 20th century military figure, Englishman who represents the British Empire, the ancient British tradition, the aristocracy, the upper classes, and so forth and so on. And that is the character that you see in the image on the right. It is a satirical image, which David Lowe created to kind of make fun of the British upper classes. So that's an interesting point. Keep in mind, this is supposed to be a propaganda series. And yet they invite somebody who is well known as a kind of critic of a certain kind of British arrogant upper class tradition, right? You see the democratic element coming into the representation of Britain in this specific propaganda series. So that's kind of interesting that people who are not typical propagandists are allowed to contribute works which are aiming to be propaganda. He's a critic of the government, and yet he can write a volume such as this on the British tradition in cartoon and comic book culture. Next, please. We have a volume on the English poets by Lord David Cecil, and it has an image, of course, of Chaucer. Again, students who are studying the Northern Anthology of English Literature, you go back there and you have, of course, the Canterbury Tales, and you have the famous Geoffrey Chaucer. So literature is very important in this series, literature and belles lettres. The next slide, please. We have a volume by Elizabeth Bowen, a very great 20th century novelist on English novelists. Again, if you check your history of English literature, you will see the name of Elizabeth Bowen in that history. She's an important writer of fiction throughout the 20th century. The image on the right is actually an illustration of Jane Eyre, the great 19th century classic, right? Jane Eyre. It is discussed in this book. Next slide, please. We have a volume on British dramatists, the British dramatic tradition by Graham Greene. He was a great dramatist as well as author of fiction. Very big name, again, in British literature and British fiction in the middle of the 20th century. Again, what I want to emphasize is that the people who contribute to this series, they're big names. These are serious writers. These are people with formidable literary careers who contribute to this series, the Britain and Picture series. Next slide, please. We have, of course, an entire section on education and religion. There's a volume on the English Bible. There's a volume on English public schools. I think you may be familiar with this. In England, when they say public schools, they do not mean national government schools. They mean private schools. It's a very old, very confusing concept, which goes back to the Middle Ages. Right? So there are a number of these very famous public schools, which are very prestigious and quite expensive. Eton, Westminster, Rugby College, and so forth and so on. So these schools are basically what today we call secondary schools, junior high schools and senior high schools. And they're very important in the British educational tradition because many of the great leaders, government officials, and so forth come from the English public schools. When they graduate from public schools, they go to Oxford and they go to Cambridge, or they go to law school in London, right? So these are the people who kind of form the British ruling classes going back to the 18th century. Next slide, please. We have, of course, great image of British history and life. We have an entire volume on the British railways. I mean, the first railway and the first train locomotive were created by the very famous Scottish engineer Stephenson, right? And that is an image of the so-called Elephant. That was the name of the very first locomotive created by Stephenson. That's the image that you have there on the left, on the cover of the book. And on the right, this is an image from the book. This is a tunnel of the railways going into London. I mean, London becomes connected to the rest of the country through the railway network. All right, next slide, please. We have volumes on social life and character, including one on English women, with an image of a famous poetess, Lady Pembroke from the 16th century. You might say, why begin a series on social life and character with English women? Well, again, remember, this is World War II. The men are fighting. You need the women at home to work hard, work in factories, work in the medical services, work in the civil services to keep the country going, right? The home front, as it is called. So women play a very important role throughout the 1930s and, you know, throughout the World War, the war years into the post-World War II years. Next slide, please. We have a volume as well on English children by a very well-known author. Again, this is a well-known author. If you go back and you look at the, you know, the Encyclopedia of British Literature, you will find this name, Sylvia Lynd, right there. Next slide. There's a volume also on British rebels and reformers with an image of Thomas More, the great author of the Utopia, the man who invented the word utopia in 1517, the first publication, first edition of this very famous book, The Utopia. Think about this again. This is a propaganda series, and it includes a volume on rebels and reformers. So the idea of social criticism and social reform becomes very much a part of the representation of British identity in this specific book series. It's a very well-written volume, by the way. I do highly recommend it. Next volume. And then, of course, we have a volume by the very great George Orwell, The English People. He writes about the character of the English people. He is, of course, the author. Let me hold up some books right here. He's the author of the very famous Animal Farm, published in 1945, a work which, by the way, is translated in many, many languages, including Bahasa. There is a Bahasa edition of Animal Farm. And he is, of course, also the author of the very great novel 1984, which is still quoted all the time, and which has been translated, of course, also in more than 150 different languages, and it is still reprinted and discussed all the time. I spent many years of my life writing and publishing about George Orwell, and currently I'm contributing a chapter to a book called The Routledge Companion to George Orwell on the reception of George Orwell in China, which has been a very interesting and very difficult, I must say, research topic for me the past year, but it's a very important topic. Now, the next slide, please. We also have volumes on topographical history, ports and harbors. World War II, ports and harbors are important, right? If you're going to fight a war and you're on an island, you got to have a navy. You need to have ports and you need to have harbors. So it's important to include an entire volume on this specific subject. Next slide, please. We have volumes on English cities and small towns by John Betjeman. By the way, John Betjeman, very big author. He became the so-called poet laureate of the United Kingdom sometime in the 1950s. Britain today, and for many years, has a so-called national poet who's known as the poet laureate. Well, John Betjeman at one point became the national poet of the United Kingdom. If you go back to the 19th century, Wordsworth, the great Wordsworth, was one of the poet laureates. Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson, was one of the poet laureates of the United Kingdom in the 19th century. So it's a very important position. And John Betjeman held this position for a number of years. Next volume, please. English Country Houses by Victoria Sackville West. Again, a very important author. Contributed a number of volumes of poetry, essays, and fiction to English literature, but she's also famous for being a very close friend of Virginia Woolf, the very great Virginia Woolf, author of Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, and many other important books. Victoria Sackville West, lived in a very famous old manor house called Knole House, which is a very ancient estate which went back to the 16th century. And it is actually Knole House which inspired the very famous novel of Virginia Woolf called Orlando. You may have heard about it. Orlando by Virginia Woolf. It is about, a nobleman who lives in a very ancient country house, but it is actually based on Knole House, which belonged to the Sackville West family. And so it is very good for Sackville West, who lived in such a country house, to talk about traditional English country houses of the aristocracy, of course. Next slide, please. British sport, very important to the British, right? We have an entire volume about British sport. And we have, of course, a discussion of golf. The Scots invented golf. And now, of course, it has become a global sport, very popular in the 21st century. And so there we are, British sport, football, rugby, mountain climbing, golf, cricket, all these kinds of traditional sports are represented in this volume. Next slide, please. We also have a volume on English inns by somebody called Thomas Burke. I want to mention this one specifically because I will come back to it in a moment. It includes, and it begins with, a discussion of the Tabard Inn. If any of you are familiar with Geoffrey Chaucer, the great poet from the 14th century, and the so-called Canterbury Tales, which is maybe the greatest classic in English medieval literature, well, the Canterbury Tales begin with a gathering of pilgrims in the so-called Tabard Inn in Southwark in London. And this is an inn which survived into the early 19th century. And we have an image of it right there from English inns. So the book begins with a discussion of the Tabard Inn, which plays such a very important role in English literary history, thanks to Chaucer and the so-called Canterbury Tales. Next slide, please. Natural history is very much included. We have a volume on the birds of Britain. We have a volume on British butterflies, and we have many other volumes also in this natural history series. Again, keep in mind, this is supposed to be propaganda. But you talk about birds, you talk about butterflies, you talk about the trees of Britain. This is soft propaganda, right? This is not aggressive propaganda such as it was being practiced in Nazi Germany, or for that matter, the communist Soviet Union under the dictator Joseph Stalin. Next slide, please. We have an entire section, as I said, on the British Commonwealth in pictures. I'm very interested in some kind of game playing which is going on here. What I mean is there's a kind of shift in the language. We have to pay attention to the discourse and the titles of these volumes. The entire series is called the British Commonwealth in pictures. But in fact, it has a volume on what? The British Colonial Empire. This is the age of imperialism. British military, political, economic, and cultural power has carved out a global empire. But then you kind of play with the language. And in the overall title of the series, you say the Commonwealth, which gives you a very different feeling from empire, right? I mean, you are very familiar with this. Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch for centuries. And you had to fight a war for independence, which you are still celebrating, right? If somebody from Holland comes to Indonesia and said, you are part of the Dutch Commonwealth, well, maybe we'll think about it for a moment and say, you didn't really call it the Commonwealth, right? It was an empire, right? It was colonialism, right? So it's a little bit different, right? So we have to pay attention to this kind of what I call discourse, the language, the selection of terms. Now, of course, one thing which happens in this series is that there are many volumes on what are called the settler colonies in the British Empire. Settler colonies are Australia, Canada, New Zealand, because those were mostly inhabited by immigrants from the United Kingdom. The majority of the people in Canada, in Australia and New Zealand actually are of European origin. They come from the British Islands, and they have become the majority in those countries. So they are kind of more white colonies. And they're still part of the British Commonwealth today. The King of Australia today is still King Charles II. King Charles is still the head of state of Canada and New Zealand, right? So that's kind of Commonwealth, yes. But these are just some parts of the British Empire. So there's indeed a volume on Australia. If you could go on to the next slide, please. There's a volume also on Canada. There's a volume on East Africa, a volume on Canada. You see the ash leaf? The ash leaf is the symbol of Canada still today, right? The Canadian ash tree. That's the symbol of Canada. So that's why we have a representation of those leaves on the cover of the volume on Canada. And then in the next page, the next slide, please, we have, of course, also a volume on New Zealand. Oh, yes, India. We have one volume on India, and we have one volume on South Africa. Why a volume on India? Well, India for many, many years was known as the jewel in the crown of the King of England. Why the jewel in the crown? Because it is the biggest and most important colony in the British Empire. So it became known as the jewel in the crown. And so you have a volume on India, and then you also have a volume on South Africa. And in the next slide, as you can see, you also have a volume on New Zealand, which is another one of the important so-called settler colonies inhabited by a majority of people coming from the British Islands. And then the whole collection of materials about the British Commonwealth was republished in an omnibus volume called The British Commonwealth and Empire. So Commonwealth and Empire come together here. So you see an interesting shift in the terminology which is used in this specific part of the Britain in Pictures series. Next slide, please. I just quickly kind of want to finish up with a contrast with Nazi Germany and the propaganda which is taking place in Germany at that time. The Nazi regime for me was odious, horrible, responsible for destruction and death of many, many millions of people all over the world. So I do not subscribe to their ideological agenda whatsoever. But I do have to admit that their propaganda machine was formidable and sophisticated. And one famous name in this respect is somebody by the name of Leni Riefenstahl, who lived from 1902 to 2003. She was a very great filmmaker and photographer, and she is recognized in histories of film and photography today as being a very great pioneer in the use of the camera, the film camera, as well as the still photograph camera, the picture camera. And we see her here in the photograph on the left with Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, and we see her there on the right in a photograph with Adolf Hitler himself. Next slide, please. One of the films she made for Germany in 1935 is represented here on the left. This is a photograph from a film called Triumph of the Will, which came out in 1935. It's both horrible and interesting at the same time because it is a celebration of the fascist regime of Germany, but it's also very sophisticated. You know, the way in which he uses the camera and the way in which he edited the film is really very impressive. I mean, she was really a pioneer in the use of the camera for taking long shots, close-ups, moving camera, camera booms, as they call them, right? She would photograph from above the crowd and so forth and so on. And here you have an example of her sitting on a trolley with a cameraman directing a camera as it is taking a photograph or shooting a scene for one of her films. She also made a film which is very famous about the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936. It's called Olympia, Festival of Nations. So I want to make a contrast between the way in which we see propaganda being practiced in England and the way it is being practiced in the Nazi Germany of the 1930s and 1940s. If you go to the next, I think this is the last slide. I think you probably can close. Yes, you can close the slide presentation. If I have maybe just, 15 minutes or so, I would like to follow up with a few more comments. Is that possible? Allow me to ask.
Yeah, yes, possible, sir.
Yes, thank you very, very much. So let me offer a little bit more analysis of the literary agenda. Also, I would say the ideology, which we see in the Britain in Picture series. One thing I want to point out is that in spite of what I think is the prominence of the authors associated with this series and its popularity with readers, close to 3 million copies of the BIP books were sold by 1950. I mean, that's a very significant achievement, right? There's only one study which exists of this series so far. It is called Britain in Pictures, A History and Bibliography, which goes back to 1995 by Michael Carney. And it's actually just a small book. Britain in Pictures by Michael Carney, 1995. That's it. This is it. In terms of scholarship about this very important propaganda project, we just have this one specific study. So that's one of the reasons also why I decided to look into it and do a more complete study. Because as I see it, this series offers a unique opportunity to examine the British literary scene from the 1930s to the immediate post-World War II years and the constructions of British and imperial/Commonwealth identities current at that time. As I already said, we have in this series a very different approach to information and propaganda than was current in Nazi Germany under the Minister for Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. So what we have here is not only a very remarkable and diverse group of writers, but also we have in this series figures who are well known for their eccentric character and or intellectual independence. I mentioned the cartoonist David Lowe as an example. He created the famous Colonel Blimp character. As you may know, a blimp is another word for a balloon. A big balloon can be called a blimp. So if you call the Colonel a blimp, what you mean is that he's blown up, he's pompous, he's pretentious, he's a kind of big fat guy who's very arrogant, right? So somebody who's that critical of the British upper classes is allowed to contribute to this series. I want to mention another example, somebody by the name of Sean O'Fowline. Sean O'Fowline, actually, he was Irish, and he contributed a volume called The Story of Ireland. He's a very great figure in 20th century Irish public life and literary history. But the amazing thing is that he participated in the Irish War of Independence in the 1910s and early 1920s. The Irish fought a war of independence against the British government. And they only achieved that independence in 1921. And he was a member of the so-called IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Ireland wanted to become a republic, independent from the British Empire. And this man fought in the IRA against the British. And yet 20 years later, when they create this propaganda series, they invite him to write the volume on Ireland, because somehow Ireland is still important and remains a part of British history. And of course, the north of Ireland, until today, Northern Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom. By the way, he later on studied at Harvard University. He was a famous author. He served as Minister of Culture in the Republic of Ireland, and so forth and so on. And when we talk about people who are intellectually independent, of course, the best example is George Orwell. George Orwell was a socialist and a free thinker all his life. He talked about the duty of the intellectual. What is it? To speak truth to power. No matter who is in power. As an intellectual, as a writer, you have to speak truth to power. You have to dare to criticize. And although he was a socialist, he became the biggest critic of communist dictatorships all over the world. So what he said is, I'm a progressive in Britain, but I believe in democracy. Equality has to be matched to freedom and liberty. And that's not what they have in communist countries, okay? They sacrifice freedom to equality, and I don't approve of that, right? And then he wrote, of course, Animal Farm, 1984, and those kinds of very important works. Now, what I mentioned here is that the effect of bringing together such a varied and eclectic mix of characters is to evoke a conception of Britain as, I would say, a nation of localities, private institutions, and distinct communities, not a national conglomerate. Maybe Germany is a national kind of, conglomerate. Britain prefers modest, amateur pleasures rather than professional activities with mass appeal. It is a country which, above all, elevates the individual above the state. And that is what I think distinguishes this propaganda series from the one that we see in Nazi Germany. I then also want to talk briefly about major discrepancies, of course. When we say Britain in pictures, all right, when we think about Britain today in the 21st century, and you think about all kinds of BBC documentaries and publications by famous British authors today, We have this image of the English and of Britain in general as a country which cherishes its countryside, its agricultural traditions, cottages, the Lake District of the great poets, of Wordsworth and so forth and so on. We think about sports and so forth and so on. We think about the British architectural tradition. We think about their love of natural history. Think about the very great contemporary biologist David Attenborough, right? David Attenborough has made so many documentary series about nature in Britain and around the world. But of course, in spite of this continuity, I also want to emphasize what I think is discontinuity. When you look at this series, it is a kind of Britain which does not really exist anymore today. Yes, the British people are kind of sentimental and talk about themselves. They will talk about their great country houses. They will talk about cottages. They will talk about the countryside. They will talk about nature. They will talk about sports. They will talk about traditions. They will talk about the royal house. They will talk about the fact that their form of government kind of goes back to the early 18th century and so forth and so on. But Britain today, in many ways, is a very, very different place. All right. What I mean is that what do we have today? We have a multicultural Britain. We've had very considerable immigration from the former British colonies, from West Africa, from the Caribbean Sea, from Canada, from Australia, from India, and so forth and so on. Who was the previous Prime Minister of Britain who just stepped down? Rishi.
From the Indian descendants, if I'm not mistaken, or Pakistan.
There you are, of Indian Pakistani origin. Rishi Sunak, second generation immigrant. Right? I believe his family is a Hindu family. But there were other members of the government who are of Pakistani, Muslim origin, Priti Patel, and many others. And the person who's now the leading candidate to become the new leader of the Conservative Party is somebody by the name of Kemi Badenoch, whose ancestors actually come from the Caribbean Sea. Right? So we have a multicultural Britain. We also have had the feminist movement, which has completely changed Britain. We have American influence, which has come in much more than before. We have the internet and so forth and so on, right? So Britain today is a very different place from what it was before. So I'm interested in this idea that we have to kind of deconstruct this very sort of, comprehensive, homogeneous picture of Britain that we see in this series. And I want to quote Walter Benjamin, the very famous German critic from the 1930s, 1940s. He wrote a series of essays, short essays called Philosophical Theses About History. And he called himself a historicist. So he says, generally people who study history sympathize with the victor. History is written from the point of view of the winner. Those who win the wars write history. But he cautioned against that. And he said, as a historian, or a historicist, as he called himself, you have to stand on the side of the loser. Because, and I quote from his work, there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. So in a way, that's what I mean. BIP. It is supposed to be a document of civilization. It's a record of British civilization. But if you read between the lines, if you kind of dig deep down into this series, violence is there. The construction of British imperial identity is there. Even Britain itself is a country which grows from England, which then kind of at the beginning of the 18th century takes in Scotland. Scotland used to be an independent kingdom until the beginning of the 18th century. Ireland was independent, became part of Britain, and then fought for its independence from Britain in the 19th and early 20th century. And Northern Ireland, and this is not liked by some people in Ireland, but Northern Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom. And there are some people who are very unhappy about that, who want Northern Ireland to become part of the Republic of Ireland, right? So that's what I mean. This is a document of civilization, which represents the best of British civilization. But it is also a document of barbarism. And so you have to kind of, at some point, dissociate yourself from the discourse of propaganda and brush history against the grain. This is also a phrase from Benjamin. You have to kind of go against the dominant historical narrative. And I don't have much time. I know we're running out of time, but go back to this example. Thomas Burke wrote a volume on English inns.
You
Was
have
Thomas
15 minutes.
Oh, excuse me, how much?
You still have 15 minutes, Prof. Don't worry.
Oh, 15 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
Burke, he contributes a volume on English inns, which is represented as an aspect of British country life and sport. Kind of interesting. Why didn't he put that in the series, some other series on character or what? Because you have lots of inns in the cities. Why talk about country life and sports and put inns in there? Well, of course, it begins with the Tabard Inn in London from the Canterbury Tales, as I mentioned a moment ago. But actually, before he contributed this volume, Thomas Burke is somebody who's very much interested in kind of what I call urban adventuring and flânerie. He wrote about the neighborhoods and working class districts and areas of London where minority people live in the 1910s and 1920s. He was interested in, and I quote from one critic, side streets, dark side streets that lead to far countries or to secret encampments camps of alien and outlaw. So he was a specialist actually of going around the big cities of England, especially London, and finding places where you have the beginnings of immigrant communities. So, for example, he wrote about Chinatown in London. There was already a small Chinatown in London in the 19th century, going on into the 21st century. So he wrote about the first Chinatown in London, which was a place called Limehouse. And he writes about that in his autobiography, Nights in Town, a London autobiography. And he also wrote a volume of stories called Limehouse Nights, Tales of Chinatown, published in 1916. And then later on, he published a second volume, More Tales of Chinatown. I believe I should have the book here with me. Yes. Limehouse Nights. And so it's all stories which take place in the Chinatown of London. And by the way, Limehouse was also one of George Orwell's favorite places in England, in London specifically. Orwell began his career with a book called Down and Out in Paris and London. Down and out means you have no money, you're out on the street. He had a little bit of money, but he dressed up as a beggar, as a homeless person, as a tramp. And he went around Limehouse and other parts of London and outside London as a beggar and lived with other beggars and recorded their life and then wrote a book about that called Down and Out in Paris and London. So what I mean is there are ghettos of immigrant peoples. There is a Chinatown in London. There's another one in Liverpool already at that time. There are small immigrant communities. There are minority voices within British culture already at that time, but they're not in this book. Yeah, Ireland is there, Scotland is there, Wales is there. But these are sort of the minority cultures of Caucasian, white British people. The immigrants are not quite there. And so Thomas Burke writes about English inns. He could have written about China House. He knows more about it than anybody else. But there is no such volume. And so that's what I mean, you have to kind of brush against the grain. You have to go kind of below the surface to see some of the things that are missing. And so that's what I mean in a way. Contemporary literature and even some of the BIP contributors were beginning to map immigrant communities of a changing Britain in the 1930s and 1940s, but they're not in the picture in the BIP volumes. Chinatown, in a way, represents, through what we call in literary criticism, alterity, otherness. As Burke says, it's really a far country. Even though it's there in London, in a way, it's really a far country in British culture. It's marginal to the extent that it represents some kind of otherness, which is not included yet in the BIP series. Now, then briefly also, let me talk about the fact that we have here what I call intermodernism in British literary culture. This critic, in a book called Intermodernism, Literary Culture in Mid-20th Century Britain from 2009, she talks about intermodernism as both a literary period and an ideology. It is, on the one hand, and I quote from her work, a literary period extending from the interwar through war and immediately post-war years. So maybe it begins sort of in the late 1920s. It goes on in the 1930s, and it goes sort of into the late 1940s. That's on the one hand. It's a literary period from the 20s to maybe 1940s. But on the other hand, it is also a kind of writing. It's an aesthetic category. And she also calls it a social formation. It's an institutional, materialist category. And it's an expression of shared values. So it's an ideological category. And she also observes that unlike the earlier modernists, and I mean James Joyce, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, Christopher Isherwood, and so forth and so on, they wrote mainly, the early modernists, for highbrow audiences, right? So, I mean, T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, it's meant for a very small audience of highly educated people, right? They write for highbrow audiences, and they publish in what is called little magazines. In fact, in Britain in the 1910s, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound first published in a magazine, which was literally called The Little Magazine, because it only has a very small audience of highly educated people who like highbrow, new modernist literature. So these intermodernist writers write mainly for popular audiences. They're influenced by the modernists. They have certain kinds of new techniques, but they write for popular audiences, and they're interested in documentary style, mass media, and cultural expressions belonging to many different fields. And I think the BIP series reflects this agenda and constitutes a fascinating site for the study of intermodernist poetics in British literary and cultural history. Now, then maybe also very quickly, a fourth and final question I would like to touch upon is the notion of home and homeland, which underlies the BIP series. I mean, if you're going to stand up for Britain, you must have some kind of idea of what is this Britain, what is this homeland that you're standing up for. So I would like to approach this through the lens of a very great American critic, Edward Said. I'm sure you are familiar with his work, the man who wrote so much about Orientalism. Edward Said actually is an American citizen of Palestinian origin. He studied in Italy and France and then the United States, and he became a professor at Columbia University for many, many years in the 20th century, and he passed away, I believe, about 15 years ago. He wrote an essay called Reflections on Exile, because he's in exile, born in Palestine, grew up in Europe, studied there, then living in the United States, right? But he was still very much identified with Palestinian culture and the Middle East. So in these Reflections on Exile, which is an essay from 2000, he examines exile and the idea of homeland in terms of its connection with nationalism. And he quotes a German critic by the name of Thomas Adorno. Thomas Adorno wrote an autobiography, Minima Moralia, which is the Latin word, Reflections from a Mutilated Life. Reflections from a Mutilated Life, published in 1951. Thomas Adorno, by the way, was a German, associated with the so-called Hamburg School of Marxist philosophy and historical studies, but he was in exile in the United States. He left Germany when Hitler came to power. He was a Marxist critic, and he left Germany. And so when he writes and publishes this book, Reflections from a Mutilated Life in 1951, he's in the United States. And his homeland, Germany, has been bombed very thoroughly and defeated during World War II. So he talks about a mutilated life because he's in exile himself, and his homeland is mutilated, is very much destroyed. So he began his exile in the USA in 1944, and he wrote against the background of the bombing and destruction of his homeland, Germany. And Said summarizes his thought, Adorno's thought, as follows. I quote from Said, ruthlessly opposed to what he called the administered world, the bureaucratic world. Adorno saw all life as pressed into ready-made forms, prefabricated homes. Modern life, we have to live it in an administered world. We have to live it in prefabricated homes. He argued that everything that one says of things, as well as every object one possesses, is ultimately a mere commodity. A commodity is something which can be bought and sold. A language is jargon. This is still Adorno, according to Said. Objects are for sale. And to refuse this state of affairs is the exile's intellectual mission. Mission, duty. And then Said also quotes Adorno's belief that the only home truly available now, though fragile and vulnerable, is in writing. If you're an exile and you're an intellectual, you create a home in your writing. And Said concludes, the exile, I'm quoting, knows that in a secular and contingent means a flexible, chaotic world, homes are always provisional, they're temporary. Borders and barriers, which enclose us within the safety of familiar territory, can also become prisons and are often defended beyond reason or necessity, like Nazi Germany. They create this kind of idea of the German homeland and they fight for it beyond reason or necessity and they end up destroying their own country. So says Adorno, exiles cross borders, break barriers of thought and experience. Now, and this is the last point I would like to make. This is where we hit upon an essential difference between the provisional, the temporary homes of the exile discussed by Said and the Britain in Picture series. The Britain in the Britain in Picture series is different. The BIP authors were not yet exiles in a world which is trending towards ever more unstable boundaries. And Britain was still home. I would argue that, in fact, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, Britain, the British Empire, is also a place with unstable boundaries. The whole world is trending in this direction of instability, of modern culture, of postmodernism. But that's not what they try to say in this series. They want to kind of freeze a certain unstable Britain in a chaotic world. So BIP gives them an opportunity to delineate, to demarcate, and defend Britain as a familiar territory. And even though this familiar territory, this home, might mean something very different to Orwell than it did, for example, to Gerald Wallop, the Earl of Portsmouth, who contributed a volume on British farm stock. So we have a volume in this series called British Farm Stock, Farm Animals, by the Earl of Portsmouth, who had a lot of land and a lot of farms, and was very devoted to farming and the British farming tradition. So for him, yes, British farm stock is home. George Orwell, a revolutionary kind of thinker in many ways, progressive person, critic of the government, he believes in Britain in some way. He believes Britain is better than the Soviet Union. Britain is better than Nazi Germany. He has a certain kind of Britain. So I think in this respect too, intermodernism reveals itself as a useful critical tool for the BIP series. As Kristen Blumel comments, intermodernism is a concept, and I quote her, with a British bias or basis. The Greater Britain and the Greater British nation did matter to the intermodernists, though they might have contested its boundaries. So they may have different definitions of the boundaries, meanings, and claims of Britain upon their own loyalty. They did not regard it as arbitrary. Okay, Britain is not arbitrary for them. Maybe for Adorno, Germany is something kind of arbitrary because he's in the States, and Germany is chaos. It's destroyed and it's occupied by the Soviet Union and by the Western powers. And in fact, Germany is divided into two at that time: East Germany, West Germany. Not Britain. All right. So there's a kind of unity. There's a kind of sense of a certain kind of unity. It's not an arbitrary topic. Hitler is the one who makes sure of that, right? As long as Hitler exists, all kinds of different British people who under normal circumstances might be quarreling with each other, they kind of come together. I'll point out very quickly in this respect that when you look at the titles of the BIP series, so many of them have some kind of spatial title. Space, places have a very specific place in the whole series. The English people, the story of Scotland, Australia, the Londoner, the guilds of the City of London, the House of Commons, the Conservative Party. The turf means where you have horse races, British farm stock, and so forth and so on. These are all kinds of places which can be pointed out on the national map of Britain, right? So you look at the titles of the volumes. So many of them you can actually put on the map of Britain because it's about anchoring a cultural identity to a specific place, to a specific location. So it's really about demarcating space. And in that sense, it is a successful propaganda series. So to sum it up, this is my last comment. Intermodernism in this respect, I think, is a functional concept which provides scholars with a literary kind of critical compass. Compass means a tool which gives you a chance to find your place on the map, right? You know, north, south, east, west, you can find your direction. That's what this is. Intermodernism is something which brings this series together and gives it a certain kind of map and a tool for navigating space. It's a literary critical compass. It's an analytical tool, but also I think it's like a guidepost, a useful guidepost for finding and valuing vital cultural forms. And it's important because once you, I think, look at this series and you put intermodernism on it, you can really map it and fix it in space and really kind of begin to understand it. If you don't do that, you go over from what? Modernism at the beginning of the century, you kind of slide through the middle of the century, and there you are in the 1970s with what? Postmodernism, the breakup of modernism, right? And you miss something in the sort of history of modernism in the 20th century. Without intermodernism, I think the history of modernism and postmodernism is cheapened, and I think is not quite as rich and comprehensive as it really should be. Okay, guys, up to there. Thank you so much. I think I'm afraid I maybe went on a little bit too long, but I thank you very much for your attention. I do apologize for the problem with the PPT at the beginning of my presentation. If we do have a little bit more time, I am, of course, quite willing to take questions and engage with discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Heng. Everyone here, I think we should give a big applause to Professor Heng. And this is a very great presentation, a very well sequentially lectures on British in pictures. And at the end of the lecture, I think we heard that Professor Heng concluded that BIP is a very successful propaganda series. Why? Because it anchors cultural identity. Why again? Because in that series, we can see specific place clearly defined and presented, yeah, because they have Scotland, Australia, England, and farm stocks. And also, Professor Heng also explained that the BIP give the opportunity to defend territory, I mean, British territory. And it's also a matter of trying to find out what happened in the past and in the present and now in the future. And I think it is time for discussion. And Professor Heng, I think they are very, let's see. Oh, on the chat box, Prof, I see there are some participants trying to ask you questions. I would like to read from the first question. It is from Ms. Retno. Professor Fincare, can we say that the search of British identity during early half of 21st century, picturing mostly on England countryside as number one, a nostalgia on Britain's greatness due to the fall of British Imperium during World War II. Number two, is it the rise of romantic anti-capitalism as Britain's writers longing on romantic era? And number three question, a British resistance towards popular culture encroaching Britain during 1950. Professor, would you like to read yourself, or do you want me to read the other question? We still have two more questions.
All right, very much. I would say that indeed, and I quote from the chat there, we can say that the search of British identity during the early half of the beginning of the opening decades of the 21st century, which to a very great extent, focus on indeed the British countryside, are a representation of nostalgia of Britain's greatness due to the transition from the British Empire to a new British identity in the late 20th century and the 21st century. So yes, indeed, nostalgia, a reaction of anti-capitalism, certain resistances to popular culture and so forth, cultural change throughout the second half of the 20th century and 21st century. All of that is very much part of this focus on certain British traditions, and especially the British countryside, in so much British culture, literature, and I would say TV programs and so forth and so on. I skipped one part. I would like to maybe go back to that and kind of maybe add more depth to the question to illustrate what I think is actually the relevance of this specific question. I thank the person who asked the question for this question, because I do indeed believe it is a very relevant topic to discuss. When you look, you take the BIP volumes and you place them to catalogs of culture documentaries by the major British television producers. And I mean mostly the BBC, the ITV, and there are a number of other ones, but these are, I think, the most important one. Maybe Channel 4, there's a channel called Channel 4 in the United Kingdom, right? We see similarities. When you think about the volume which I discussed by Virginia Woolf's friends, Vita Sackville West, the volume is called The English Country House. So once again, country house means the manor houses of the great noble families who owned a lot of land throughout England in the countryside and built big houses, surrounded by beautiful gardens and forests, kind of lakes and what have you, and then farms, because they derive much of their income from farming and from the rents which are paid from those farms to the country manor houses, right? That's what this book is about. The great houses of the English nobility, going back many, many centuries to the late Middle Ages. Well, there's an architectural historian who's quite famous, who's made many television series by the name of Dan Cruikshank. Well, in 2011, he made a BBC documentary series called The British Country House Revealed. They're still very much in love with their country houses. Although, one fact which has to be pointed out is that many of these country houses are very expensive to maintain. When they pass on from one generation to the next, the inheritance tax which you have to pay to the government is also very expensive. So actually, a lot of these traditional country houses are in decline, have been bought up by American millionaires and what have you, right? Big companies also buy up these country houses. A lot of them have been turned into what? Bed and breakfast locations. Or maybe they have meeting facilities for marriages and for corporations and so forth and so on, right? So they're so expensive. They're declining. But you still make a series about them. The English Country House Revealed. That's Dan Cruikshank. One volume in the BIP series is called, by Mr. Lockley, Islands Round Britain. Well, Martin Clunes, another documentary filmmaker working for ITV, in 2009, made a series called Islands of Britain. Same thing, he goes around the islands of Britain and makes a documentary series for television. Arthur Elton, I showed the volume in BIP is called British Railways, volume 83. Well, there's a famous guy by the name of Michael Portillo, who has made a multi-year documentary series, which is still going on today, called Great British Railway Journeys. Now, he also went to India, Great Indian Railway Journeys, Great Chinese Railway Journeys, and so forth. But he began with a journey around Britain, Great British Railway Journeys. Michael Portillo, by the way, is a former British Conservative Party government minister who served in the government of the very famous Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of Britain in the 1980s and 1990s. This is a very senior government politician. He's in love with the railways, and he made this series, Great British Railway Journeys. There's a volume in the series, number 59, by somebody called Harry Roberts, called English Gardens. Well, there's a guy who's very famous in Britain by the name of Monty Don. Monty Don has made many, many series about gardens, British gardens, but also Italian gardens, French gardens, even Japanese gardens, and so forth and so on. But yeah, his first series was British Gardens, Monty Don, M-O-N-T-Y, and then his last name, Don. one more. There's a series, very successful BBC series called A Picture of Britain. A Picture of Britain by celebrated BBC journalist David Dimbleby. Oh, he's a legendary name as a BBC journalist. He was on the BBC for more than 50 years from the time when he was a young man. He just recently retired. David Dimbleby, very, very famous. He made a documentary series called A Picture of Britain, which also inspired a major exhibition of the same name at Tate Britain. Tate Britain is a very famous museum in London. So series on TV, big exhibition at the Tate Britain. And I should add, all of these documentary series exist not only as TV broadcasts, which are reproduced on DVD sets. I have some of these DVDs in my collection here, but also there are companion books, right? So image and text coming together. So David Dimbleby has A Picture of Britain TV series, but there's a book called A Picture of Britain, which accompanies the BBC series, right? So you see the continuity between BIP 1940s and what we have in British culture beginning of the 21st century. But that indeed is a kind of what? Is a cultural enterprise which wants to stabilize some aspects of British history and cultural identity at a time of tremendous change, when actually Britain has become a multicultural nation. There was an interesting popularity poll a number of years ago. What is the most popular British dish today? If you ask people in Britain 40, 50 years ago, no question about it, the most popular British food is fish and chips. Fish and chips. Chips in Britain actually means like what the Americans call French fries. It's deep fried potatoes, fish and chips. But in this recent poll, which was undertaken, I think it was about 3, 4 years ago, it is amazing. Chicken tikka masala.
Huh?
Chicken tikka masala, which actually is Indian food, is spicy curry chicken with thick sauce. It comes from the Indian communities, which started immigrating a long time ago, right? So since the 1940s, 1950s, this has become more and more popular. And now in the 21st century, this is something which every Englishman, every person in Britain eats on a regular basis. It's the most popular Indian food. And by the way, famous cooks in India will tell you it's not quite Indian curry, okay? It's kind of a little bit adapted, adjusted. It's some kind of British curry. Yes, it's spiced and so forth, but they add a lot of cream, thick cream. They don't quite do that in India, right? They use yogurt or something else, right? So that's the situation now in Britain today. So it's actually a very different country. And the greatest writers in Britain today are what? People who come from immigrant families. Kazuo Ishiguro was born in Japan, but grew up in Britain and is an English citizen, won the Nobel Prize. Shiva Naipaul from Trinidad, but from an Indian family. His ancestors came from India in the 19th century. He grew up in Trinidad in South America. As a young man, he went to Britain to study at Cambridge and stayed in Britain. Writes in English all his life, became British citizen, won the Nobel Prize. Ben Okri from Nigeria, won the Nobel Prize. And so forth and so on. Ali Smith, her ancestors come from Pakistan. It goes on and on and on, right? These are all the great British writers today, actually. British literature today is very sort of multicultural and international. But this kind of BBC, ITV documentary sort of, entertainment, culture entertainment product is kind of nostalgic and goes back to an older Britain, which is also the Britain which is very much celebrated in BIP. I'm sorry, I don't know if I answered your question. I got carried away a little bit. But that was my effort to answer this question. But I know there are other questions there. Maybe I should take a look at those, right?
Right. It's from Amsterdam Lim, Prof.
Okay.
And
Amsterdam, of course, is in Holland, right?
And when I read the question, it reminds me of what you said about David Law, that critic, but used as propaganda. I think that's interesting.
Right. So we can make a distinction between government propaganda and genuine expression of love for country. I would say that's the tricky thing about government propaganda, because when it is successful and communicated very wonderfully and correctly, it actually does inspire real love for the country. Orwell was a very critical Englishman, always quarreling with the government about all kinds of things. But when the war began and German planes appeared in the sky above Britain and bombs started coming down on London, and his own house actually was hit by a bomb, he said, "Hey guys, we are British, okay? We're going to fight this war, all right? Doesn't matter. You could be left wing, you could be center, you could be right wing. Today, everybody is English, right?" So that, I mean, is genuine love of country, I think. And in the meantime, yes, there are tens of thousands of British people in the military troops fighting in France, fighting all over the world, fighting in the sands of North Africa and so forth to stop the Nazi Empire. And so I think, yes, BIP is government propaganda, but I would say there's a lot of genuine love of country in there. And that's what makes it, to a very great extent, successful. Maybe in Nazi, that's the terrible thing about propaganda. In Nazi Germany, the propaganda is so very hard, so very aggressive, so very monolithic, exaggerated, monumental. But I bet if you went to Germany in 1939, before the war began, and before German people really began to suffer, and you ask an ordinary German citizen in the street, "Do you love Hitler? Do you love those propaganda films?" They will say, yes, they did. Right? They don't see clear. I mean, the brainwashing effort is so sophisticated. Everybody is swept up in this national emotion of what they call what? National socialism, right? That's what they are. The National Socialist Party of Germany is totally dominating this country at that time. So that's the tricky thing about propaganda. It can be so obviously manufactured by a government institute or a ministry of propaganda, and yet people believe it. People really believe it. That's what George Orwell wrote about in 1984, the very famous image of Big Brother. It's so obviously a government construct. Nobody even knows if Big Brother is really still alive. Nobody has ever really met Big Brother, but you see his picture everywhere. And when people see it, they salute. They stand to attention. They love Big Brother. Right? That's how propaganda works. Sometimes what is real and what is artificial is very hard to distinguish.
The third question, bro.
Well, actually, it says, please kindly fill out the attendance list below. Oh, okay. Yes, there's one question from
One question.
Professor Rivka, yes. With regard
Yes.
to the representation of different religions in British propaganda, could you please elucidate how Britain approached this issue, specifically with regard to social and cultural inclusivity? Well, there you are. In the section on religion in Britain, we have, of course, the British religious tradition represented, which means basically the Anglican Church and the Christian Bible, which was translated into English, of course, in the 16th century. This was, of course, a momentous shift in British history, which took place in the early 16th century, right? Britain was a Catholic Christian country. But under King Henry VIII, it broke away from the Catholic Church and established a reformed, you could say, Protestant church, the so-called Anglican Church. And the English king, the monarch of England, became the head of the English church. So they have their sort of majority Christian church, which is the Anglican Church. In addition, of course, there were still many Catholic people in England, and there were also Protestant people who were more conservative, perhaps Presbyterians and so forth, Puritans who were outside the Church of England, and there was a minority of Jewish people, and undoubtedly there were some Muslim people here and there in Britain. But that's where the problem comes in. You see, you are quite right to ask this question. If you read this series, there's no talk about Islam. Although, as I'm sure there were some small Islamic immigrant communities and families in some places in Britain. I'm sure there were still Jewish people here and there in the United Kingdom. But there's no volume on Judaism in the United Kingdom. There's no volume on Islam in the United Kingdom. And this is what I meant when I talked about the example of Thomas Burke. There were Chinese people in Britain. There were Chinatowns. But there's no volume about Chinatown. And similarly, in the series on religion in Britain, there's no volume on non-Christian religions, which were already beginning to be represented, I'm sure, in British life. And so that is indeed a good question. And this goes back to the point made by Walter Benjamin, right? Every document of civilization is some way also a document of barbarism. It's a document of barbarism because it leaves out things, or it manipulates the facts to maybe kind of, cover up the margins. Okay, at no point can you say at that time, Jewish people or Chinese people, Buddhists, or maybe Muslim people in Britain, the majority. It's not the case, but they're there somewhere. They're there. And they're not filled into the picture, right? That's the point. That's the point. That's what Benjamin says. When you study history, don't just stand on the side of the victors. You have to kind of brush against the grain, against the main movement. And that's when you begin to see missing parts or certain kinds of, certain kinds of deconstructions which are taking place, or maybe some parts where the machine doesn't quite fit together, right? Propaganda effort is like a machine. It's nicely fitted together. But if you look at it very carefully, if you go underneath, you see there are somehow, little bits and pieces which maybe don't quite fit together. And this is definitely the case when it comes to the issue of religion. If you would like me maybe to just quickly clarify in the section on education. So we have a section on education and religion. In that section, we have a volume on English education. We have a volume on the English church by a bishop, one of the English bishops. We have a volume on the English Bible, which is a rich topic because, you have the whole story of translation from Latin and Hebrew into English, right? There are many different English translations and so forth. So there's a story to be told there. There is a volume on English public schools. There's a volume on English hymns and hymn writers. Hymns are songs of the Christian church. There's a volume on British universities, and that's it. So I would say 3 out of 6 volumes are actually on education. 3 volumes in this section on religion, education and religion are about religion, but these 3 volumes are about the English church, the English Bible, and English hymns and hymn writers. So it means no non-Christian religion is covered anywhere in this sequence. Okay, so that would be my answer to this specific question. Another very good question. Thank you very much for that question.
Thank you. So if I may ask you, Prof, the one that you said about religious minority, does it in line with Adorno's statement about the exile? Because the exile cross borders and break barrier. The exiles know that secular home are always professional. Do you think that religious minority is, equal to the exile?
You are quite right. In order to discover these missing narratives from the majority discourse, one has to take up the position of the exile. I would say Adorno is very much in line with Benjamin. He was a contemporary of Walter Benjamin, and I think he was influenced by his thinking. So, studying history against the grain, or studying history from the point of view of the exile, studying literary traditions from the point of view of the exile, I think is what gives you the intellectual flexibility, and maybe we could also say honesty,
Right.
to think critically and to think with an open mind, and to recognize the presence of the other, the cultural other, the gender other, the other in every respect, the one who is not necessarily part of your discourse, but who has a discourse, who has a narrative, which is interesting and valuable, and it should be acknowledged and included in the overall representation of the human adventure, because that's what it ultimately is, right? And I think that is what has been kind of, I think, the achievement of British literature in the later 20th century, continuing in the 21st century, because as I said, the discourse of the minority in many ways has become the discourse of the majority. All the great writers in the British tradition are originally from other places. Salman Rushdie had an interesting phrase. He's a writer from India. He had an interesting phrase many, many years ago when he said, the story of British literature today is the empire writes back. And he said that at the time when this very famous film came out, The Empire Strikes Back. Do you know the Star Wars films? George Lucas, the American filmmaker, in the late 1970s, began a series of popular science fiction films called the Star Wars films. And the first film in that series was called Star Wars. And that film ends with the victory of rebels against the galactic universal empire. But the story goes on. In part 2, the Empire Strikes Back, and the rebels are kind of in trouble. And that's not the end of the story, because there's a part 3, part 4. The whole thing, Star Wars, goes on for many more films. Right? That's Hollywood does things. They make money from making many, many films. There's always a sequel, right? But in the second part, which was also made by George Lucas, we have The Empire Strikes Back. That's the title of the film. And so Salman Rushdie said, when you look at literature, the British come with their literature. And in India and everywhere, they tell people, oh, you should study English. And you should read Shakespeare. And you should read Jane Eyre and, the Bronte sisters and Victorian literature. And you should read Charles Dickens and, all this kind of stuff, right? The great British tradition, Alexander Pope and so forth, so on, right? And what happens in the 19th and 20th century is that we, the colonials, this is what Salman Rushdie means. People in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Trinidad, in Australia, in all the British colonies, all over the world. Well, we studied English. We did what you said. We studied English and we mastered the language and we enriched it. We created new kinds of English, Indian English, Canadian English, Australian English. And we start writing and telling our stories in the English language. And it's great stuff. You got wonderful literature coming from India. You got wonderful literature coming from Australia in English, maybe published in London, but written by people who originally come from Australia, from Canada, Alice Munro, Margaret Atwood, right? All kinds of Nobel Prize winners from many, many different countries, from India, from Nigeria, from Ghana, from South Africa, right? And it's great stuff. And the empire has struck back, right? The metropolitan center of the empire dominated us. And now we, the marginals, from the edge, from the periphery of the empire, we have mastered your language and we're using it to express ourselves and our culture. And we're enriching the world of English literature. And that is indeed the case if we have students of English literature, right? If you use the Norton Anthology of English Literature in your English literature classes, it has all these writers, right? It has Margaret Atwood and Alice Munro from Canada. It has writers from India. It has V.S. Naipaul from Trinidad and so forth and so on. Chinua Achebe, Nigeria, Nobel Prize winner, right? Chinua Achebe. He talked about this a lot, the way in which African people have reinvented the English language and used it to tell their story. So that is indeed, I think, it's the position of the exile first, but then also becomes the position of what? The native peoples of all these many different cultures and countries. They have grown up and they have liberated themselves and they use the language and the culture of the former master to express themselves and to become real citizens of global cultural discourse and production. And that, I think, is the richness of this literature. Thank you for this question, indeed. Thank you very, very much. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I went over 11 o'clock.
Okay, that's good. Thank you very much, Prof. Heng. And I think we come to the end of the session, and it is quite amazing, quite enlightened that we have Professor Heng Fien Keir here. He started with a can of Schweppes, a soda drink from 1850, who still existed till today. And then he explained all the narrative in BIP production, ending up in the anchoring of our cultural identity. And then it successfully triggered questions about religion, about biases, about the dominations of the elite, things like that. And I believe that everyone here, hundreds of participants here today, we are all enlightened by your lecture, Professor Heng. So thank you very much. We give applause to Professor Heng. Thank you very much. And I would like to give the opportunity to the MC again. Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for your wonderful, wonderful active participation and your questions.
All right, thank you so much once again for Professor Hang for an amazing lecture this morning regarding propaganda and literary representation in British culture, and to Professor Arido for leading the main station as moderator. Also, a big applause for the audience enthusiasm and also active participation. We do really hope you found this session insightful and valuable. Then, yeah, before we end this session, there will be a closing statements from Professor Catur Keprianto, MPhum, as well as giving a certificate of appreciation to Professor Hang for becoming our special speaker today. For Professor Catur, if everything else said, then time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much to the MC, to the Honorable Visiting Lecturer, Professor Dr. Heng Finkier from Overseas Chinese University, to the Dean of Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Diponegoro, Professor Dr. Alamsyah MPhum, and the Head of English Literature Program, Dr. Oktiva Heri Chandra MPhum. And also special thanks to Bapak Arido Laksono SS MPhum, who is the amazing moderator, and especially to all participants in this visiting lecture. Prof. Heng, may I introduce myself? I'm Catur Keprianto. Actually, in this case, I am the representative of the Dean of Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Diponegoro, and Bapak Dr. Oktiva Heri Chandra, the head of English Literary Study Program. In this case, I representative to close this Zoom meeting with the nice enlightened idea from Prof. Dr. Heng Finkier from Overseas Chinese University. Ladies and gentlemen, in this valuable chance, may I say thank you very much to Bapak Prof. Dr. Heng Finkier from Overseas Chinese University, who has given the valuable lecturing and materials on the specific topic on a nice and a good topic that is propaganda and literary representation in British culture. Visually appreciate on your nice presentation, and I believe that all materials on the presentations and discussion are very interesting and provide positive impacts, enlightening especially to the students of Universitas Diponegoro and of course to all participants. I'm sure that this amazing visiting lecture gives some benefits and advantages, especially about the studies on culture and all information from Prof. Dr. Heng. Yeah, and in this case, Prof. Heng, to appreciate this visiting lecture, there will be a certificate of presenter, and this certificate especially for Professor Dr. Heng Finkier from Overseas Chinese University. That's the certificate of presenter. And for this case, may I thank you very much, Prof. Dr. Heng Finkier from Overseas Chinese University. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I look forward to seeing all of you in the near future in Semarang. I hope to be able to come at some point and visit all of you once again. It's been a while since I've been to Semarang.
Thank you very much, Prof.
I would like to have the chance to come soon.
Great. Let me know.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Goodbye, everybody, and thank you so much. Best
Goodbye,
wishes.
Prof. Heng.
Thank you.
Thank
Best
you.
Best wishes to you all.
Nice.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Prof. Heng.
Excuse me, Professor Heng. Sorry
Yes.
to interrupt. Probably we can take some documentations for like capturing this moment together. If you don't mind, we can take some documentations.
Some documentation. You mean take a group photograph? Everybody on the
Yes,
screen?
group photograph with
Okay.
everyone else.
All right. So I think, do you have the control or what? How many people are on the screen now? I'm not sure. Do we need to?
The MC will take control.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So I will help for the counting. For everybody who haven't opened their camera yet, you have probably like please kindly open your camera if you don't have any problem.
Yeah.
And on a count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, once again, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you so much for everyone who participates in today's event.
Great.
Yeah, it's such a great things to have you all here.
Have a good day, Prof.
And don't forget to fill the attendance form that's sent by operator on the chat box below for the audience. And I apologize for the mistakes I made today as a master ceremony, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Prof. Heng.
You're
Good day.
welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Same to you. Same to you, and best
Yeah.
wishes to you all.
Yeah. This is for you too.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.